Thank you very much, Carolyn. Good morning, everybody. Elna and I have two wonderful daughters, gracious like their mother, beautiful like their mother, cheeky like their mother. And they fight with me as if it is a life's vocation. So now I've been listening all three these mornings to your wonderful and generous introductions, and I know what I'm going to do. I will ask whoever is responsible, Dean Sterling, to package these introductions so that I can take them home. And when Sarah and Andrea fight with me, all I need to do is to push the button. I will win every argument with this generosity that they show in introducing me to the audiences. Once again, thank you so much, Dean Sterling, and the committee responsible for the Lyman Beecher lectures for this wonderful privilege. I have thoroughly enjoyed the last 2 days with you. I hope to enjoy today as well, and I hope that you have too. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for your wonderful, wonderful welcoming ways in which you have made Elna and I feel so welcome here on Yale campus. The seashore was where Miriam first revealed the power of her inclusive, joyful, prophetic leadership. After that, after Exodus 15, she disappears. She is not mentioned again, and it is not until the book of Numbers in the wilderness that she is allowed back into the story. The wilderness becomes the place of the final revelation of the power of Miriam's prophetic calling. Phyllis Tribble vividly speaks of the wilds of the wilderness. It is more than just a place of wandering. The uncertainties, the complaints, confusions, and conflicts makes this truly a wild place. Everything, including the deity, becomes ambivalent. The people rebel, and this causes great shifts in the narratives, but there is more at hand, Tribble writes. Entangled in the wilderness, she says, multiple layers of tradition defy source analysis and internal coherence to become much like the chaos they report. The task of the interpreter is to discern Miriam's story amid all the muddle. In these contestations and rebellions, Miriam becomes crucial, as we shall see. It is her radical engagement that raises the serious questions, namely the interconnectedness of the meaning of liberation, the quality of leadership, the integrity of revolution, and the nature of the God of justice and freedom. The wilderness might serve very well as a metaphor for where we ourselves find ourselves at this stage of our history. Our struggles for freedom are in question. What we call leadership is in question. The God we call upon is in question. Half our world is in rebellion, and we do not precisely always know why we are in rebellion. Traditional interpretations read the series of rebellions that we meet in the book of Numbers as a lack of faith in the promises of Yahweh, which lays a heavy burden on the leadership of Moses. The blame is on the recalcitrant people. Naomi Gretz appropriately urges us to read Miriam's role in the wilderness within the context of recurring rebellion against Moses, a people's rebellion, she calls it. It begins in Numbers 11. Ominously, the chapter opens with the reference to Taberah, which means burning, a fire that destroys only the periphery of the camp is Yahweh's inflamed response to the people's first complaints. But that fire is only the beginning. The growing rebellious restlessness reveals as much about the people as it does about Moses and as it does about the God Moses calls upon. But what Gretz called a people's rebellion, Dutch Hebrew Bible scholar Berend Marsing identifies as the rebelliousness of a disgruntled group identified as rabble, a mixed company, he says, of people who came along with the Israelites when they left Egypt. Philip J. Budd thinks that the degree of contempt one detects in the word riffraff, indicates those among the Israelites who, quote, are governed not by powers of discrimination and insight, but by sensual appetite. At this point, the anger of the Lord does not yet claim human lives, although comes perilously close, and the people are now put on alert that complaining against Moses comes with great risk. It is only later that the text discloses that the complaints are about food, to be precise, the lack of meat. And for Marsing, it is among the rabble that the demand for food begins and spreads to the Israelites. This mixed company of riffraff may be the rabble here, but by the time the rebellion reaches its peak in Numbers chapter 20, the people will all be rabble in Moses' eyes. At this point, the pretext is the boring menu of manna every day that makes them long for the plenty of Egypt. Earlier, they were somewhat vaguely longing for the flesh pots of Egypt way back in Exodus 16. Now, in their heightened agitation, the abundance and the variety of Egypt's menu is detailed. And that's in verses 4 to 6, where they talk about in Egypt we could have fish and meat and garlic and herbs. Moses' response is intense and deeply personalized as he takes his plight to God. He uses words like onrush, pressure, attack. The Vulgate repeats his why 3 times. There are immediate consequences. A, Moses realizes that the risks of so highly personalized leadership might be too much. Second, Yahweh offers a solution, the sharing of responsibility for governance by the appointment of 70 elders. So perhaps even though the complaint is ostensibly about food, Moses' political instincts alert him to the slippery slope of underestimating small early warning signs. The institution of the elders is a device for the sharing of responsibility. However, it soon becomes clear that sharing of responsibility does not mean sharing of power. The power seems to remain solidly in Moses' hands. What Moses and God propose and implement, however, is not genuine transformation of leadership. It is at most piecemeal reform. Almost immediately, the limitations of Moses' reform style of leadership are exposed. It remains an exclusivist regime. The elders did not really share power with Moses. Moses' authority remained unchallenged. They were only given some of the Spirit that was upon Moses. In reality, that was a top-down arrangement, not an unreserved gifting, seemingly in Moses' control, a spiritual trickle-down act of limited power and hence of limited effect. The elders began to prophesy, and then the text tells us they do not do so again. However, 2 rogue prophets who remained in the camp emerge, Eldad and Medad. Is it in rebellion against the severe limitation of the democratization of leadership? Only the 70 and a still unchallengeable Moses? Or is it in support of Moses that they prophesy. When the elders stopped prophesying, and we are not told why, these two prophesy because the Spirit rested on them, we read. The contents and the target audience of their prophecies, the text does not disclose. Enough people hear them, though, and news of this extraordinary event spreads quickly through the camp. Not surprisingly, Joshua, from the circle of Moses' chosen men, already at a young age Moses' protege, and in total support of Moses' leadership, maybe possibly seeing his own chances of taking over the leadership, threatened by this bold act by these two rogue prophets, together with another unidentified young man, maybe somebody part of Joshua's transition team, ran to complain to Moses. Moses, however, sees their concern for what it is. "Are you jealous for my sake?" he asks. But instead of admonishing Eldad and Medad, Moses utters the surprising and still inspiring words, "Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his Spirit on them." One cannot really imagine this to be a corrective on Yahweh's decision that Moses should choose only 70 elders on whom some of his prophetic spirit should rest, while Moses himself would have wanted what we today would call full participatory and inclusive democracy. Clearly, Moses saw no danger in these men also having received this gift. Perhaps Moses thought that their concerns were about personal ambition, not reflecting the will of all the people. Or was the deciding factor, after all, that they were male? For them, there is no rebuke and no punishment. The fact that out of the whole camp, only two very self-interested men raised a complaint may perhaps also mean that the people were indeed ready for a less authoritarian rule, a nascent yearning for the egalitarian community Israel would become, as Norman Godwald has argued, before the disastrous longing for a king in order to be like the other nations that we meet in 1 Samuel chapter 8. If it is, that yearning will return more forcefully in later chapters. It is Miriam who will radically overturn the situation. Has the Lord only spoken to Moses? Has the Lord not also spoken through us, she asks. 2 sentences of 7 words each are about to shake the patriarchal world of the trekkers through the wilderness. Miriam speaking against Moses, so we recall Gretz's reminder, occurs within the broader context of the people's rebellion, or better, the recurring and intensifying rebellions beginning at Rephidim in Exodus 17 and continuing in Numbers 11, 12, 14, 16, and 20. It begins with the rumblings about food. In Numbers 11 and 12 follow the independent prophecies of Eldad and Medad, the response of Moses, and then Miriam's question. In chapter 14, we find the people's fearful response to the spies' report becomes the issue. Here, for the first time, the people are explicit. Not only do they want to return to Egypt, they now want a new leader. Let us, they say, not God, choose a captain. God wants to strike the people with pestilence. Moses intervenes, however, and God forgives, but not totally. Chapter 16 tells of a revolt with strong priestly undertones led by Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And this is more serious, representing a rebellion from different groups, some of them from the elite in Israel, leaders of the congregation, chosen from the assembly, well-known men, verse 2 tells us. You have gone too far, they say to Moses. All the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. So why do you then exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? It's getting more serious now, this issue. This call for egalitarian inclusivity, so entirely different from before, and heard here for the first time, and heard here only after Miriam's intervention in chapter 11, proves too much. Again, God strikes on behalf of Moses. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up, along with their households. Everyone belonged to Korah and all their goods, says verse 32. But a rebellion on this scale, even if behind the populist calls one might suspect motives of power, authority, and privilege connected to the political dynamics around the priesthood, had to be dealt with more thoroughly. And this God we meet here is nothing if not thorough. Not only Moses in his political supremacy, but this time Aaron as well in his priestly authority would be secured. And fire came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men offering the incense. Verse 35. This is on top of those who had already perished. The whole congregation now joined the rebellion as the quarrel over priestly functions and privileges seems to tap into some deeper vein of dissatisfaction. You have killed the people of the Lord, they tell Moses. And through it all, Moses' control with God's aid, God strikes the people with a plague, holds up still, albeit clearly shaken, until chapter 20. Tribble's description of these events as chaotic is no hyperbole. It is, however, with Miriam's intervention in chapter 12 where everything changes. Philip Budd suggests that essentially Miriam represents those who speak against the representatives of Mosaic authority. This and nothing more, he says, is the point of the story. Miriam's suitability as opponent in the story, he writes, lies simply in the fact that she is no more than a leader figure from the past. Her prophetic connections were valuable because they showed that even those who claimed such inspiration, prophetic inspiration, had no right to speak against Moses. There is a uniqueness and supremacy about Mosaic revelation which must be recognized and acknowledged by all, he says. Budd's comment on this matter should give us pause on two counts. First, he places Miriam's prophetic role, as he writes, in inverted commas, thereby placing the authenticity of her prophetic action at the seashore in doubt for his readers. Was Miriam a pretender, an opportunist now to be finally exposed and dealt with? The authenticity of her prophetic action at the seashore is now solidly in doubt. Second, even if granted a role at the seashore, she is simply a leader figure from the past. Whatever she might have been at the seashore is now over. The new leadership is male, and emphatically so. Miriam, groping for past glories, and those for whom she speaks who have failed to move on. But this proves the point so forcefully made by Cheryl Exum, that since biblical literature was produced by and for an androcentric community, women in the stories are male constructs. They serve androcentric interests. Where women are concerned, one must be suspicious of the motives of male narrators or of male exegetes, it seems. While I do not think that this particular suspicion applies to the role of the midwives in Exodus 1, as Exum also argues, I do think that it is applicable here. Not just in the story, but in the commentary as well. As I read Budd, Miriam was allowed to play the prophetic role at the seashore in order to later show the absolute supremacy of Mosaic male leadership. Her role is important only insofar as it serves as a tool in the androcentric narrative, to be used as an example of what will happen to those who dare to challenge that authority. That Miriam, not Aaron, despite him being mentioned as well, was the example chosen, means that the issue was not just about the uniqueness and supremacy of Mosaic leadership and authority, as Bud argues. It was about the uniqueness and supremacy of patriarchal leadership and authority. And here it is set in stone, not just for Moses, but for generations to come. The author is killing two birds with one stone, so to speak, making the matter of patriarchal supremacy and its untouchability not merely coincidental, but systemic. In dealing so emphatically with Miriam, the narrator also decisively deals with the image of God Miriam has held up at the seashore. Again, the narrator provides us with a pretext: the Cushite woman that Moses had married. But mentioned only once, she disappears from the story. And within this broader context, the matter of the Cushite woman functions more as an added confusion to the text than providing any real reason for what occurs. Since we know nothing specific or more about this woman, says Phyllis Tribble, we can only speculate. With accurate hermeneutical suspicion, Tribble and Graetz raise important questions around the issue. Is this a question of racism, or perhaps of ritual cleanliness? Why does the narrator set woman against woman? Why does Moses remain silent when accused by Miriam and Aaron? And why did God have to defend Moses' honor in such a drastic way? Those are all important questions. And Graetz's question, why was Miriam punished and not Aaron? And her response to it perhaps covers all those questions and exposes the heart of the matter here. This is what she writes: I suggest that Miriam was punished with leprosy because women in the biblical world were not supposed to be leaders of men, and that women with initiatives were reproved when they asserted themselves with the only weapon they had, namely their power of language. In any event, the pretext cannot be sustained and crumbles before the real question Miriam raises, and it is this. It is the question of prophetic authority. Miriam speaks, and she asks not only how Moses speaks, but also whether it is Yahweh who speaks, if Yahweh speaks only through Moses. You all did not hear me. Let me read that again. She asks not only how Moses speaks, but also whether it is in fact Yahweh who speaks, if Yahweh speaks only through Moses. The rogue prophets episode interrupts but does not override the story of the first rebellion, which is picked up again in verse 31. And that episode ends in tragedy. But as I see it, the point is not so much the punishment meted out to those who rebelled, even though in itself that punishment does stun the mind. The point here is the cool, calculated, deliberate premeditation of it all, and the shock and awe with which it is executed. Between chapter 11, verse 16, and chapter 11, verse 23, Yahweh and Moses concoct not just the plan of the election of the 70, but also a way to punish the rebellious. The plan is to invite the people to a ritual feast for which they must consecrate themselves, says verse 18. It is a preparation for a solemn religious occasion, Marcion calls it, with God providing an abundance of meat. Even though the story provides hints of something more sinister afoot. The people will eat meat, it says, until it comes out of their nostrils. The people suspect nothing. The plan itself remains a secret between Moses and Yahweh. There is also a lengthy conversation about the availability of the meat the rebels craved, and which should be ready for the feast. And it is told in a way that leads up to Moses as having to be convinced of the power of God to provide so much meat. Moses is argumentative in the issue. There are not enough flocks in the world, he says. Not enough sheep or other animals to provide the meat. And then he says, are there even enough fish in the sea? Which I find a strange question to ask in the middle of the desert. God ends the argument by asking, is the Lord's power limited? As this exchange concludes, the question arises, does Moses really not suspect anything, or is he simply anxious that Yahweh might be underestimating the logistics involved? As the story continues in verse 31, three things become very clear. One, the invitation to a feast turns out to be an act of premeditated deceit. There really is no other way to put it. The people seem to have been lured with deceitful promises. They are told that they will have a feast lasting a whole month. Instead, they have consecrated themselves for a feast of death. Two, the unlimited power of the Lord was, after all, not the power to mercifully provide, as is claimed in verses 22 and 23. It was the power to mercilessly destroy. Three, the act is both ritual, a feast for which they must be consecrated, and it is also political, because it becomes a lesson not only in the nature of the power and the glory of God, but also in the untouchability of Moses' rule. As the narrative has it, the God who comes to Moses' defense is utterly ruthless. The terror inflicted upon those who challenge Moses will remain a bitter lesson for all. It goes precisely as the divine plan intended. The people sat down to eat and they would not stop, but if this were meant as a divine punishment, could they even stop? They gorged themselves on the quails. In a horrific scene, through nausea and choking and vomiting, they die while the meat was still in their teeth, we read. With the fresh mass graves behind them, the survivors journeyed from this place of destruction to Hazarot. They leave the many dead bodies behind them, but they will carry the terrifying reality of the wrath of the God of Moses with them as they go. But other terrorized now cowed into submission. While others might be, Miriam clearly is not. Miriam spoke. Naomi Grace remarks, the rabbis wonder why the Hebrew word for spoke is in singular form rather than in plural form, since the text says that Miriam and Aaron spoke. Why does Miriam, they ask, she says, a woman precede Aaron, since ladies first was not a principle in ancient times? It is an issue because it is clear that it is Miriam who takes the initiative here. She is providing leadership in stark contrast to the Mosaic leadership, and it is a sin that will not be easily forgiven. Miriam's act comes as a crucial intervention in the rebellion. In reality, it has the effect of a paradigm shift in the rebellion, from trivialities to matters of fundamental importance, from male leadership to female leadership. Miriam introduces the real issues, in my view, of the people's participation in liberation, of the character of that liberation, the quality and integrity of leadership, the questions of power and authority. She raises matters that she has given leadership in before at the seashore, namely the legitimacy of the radical inclusion of all the people, male and female, in God's acts of liberation. Instead of speaking under the pretext of less important matters, food, for example, Miriam's question goes to the root of the matter. She hides nothing. Moses, increasingly autocratic and increasingly unpopular rule. Miriam's critical question also exposes a basic fault line in the rebellion itself, embedded in the reasoning of the male rebels, the nostalgic yearning for Egypt, the longing for the non-existent kindness of the oppressor in Egypt, the desire to return to the imagined safety of Mitzrayim instead of facing the hardship that come with struggles for freedom. And still, it is about more. A world of meaning rests on the question, has the Lord spoken only to Moses? Up till now, the storyteller has taken great pains to ensure that we understand that Moses and Moses alone is God's chosen instrument. Also, it is never Moses on his own who makes decisions, but Moses and God. And when God's anger flares up on behalf of Moses, the punishment is swift and severe, as we have seen with the fire and the feast of quails. Miriam's question is not only about the channel of God's voice, it is about the character of Israel's God. Who is this God Moses claims to be on his side, who gives him sole authority, who punishes and strikes and kills at the slightest sign of challenge and protest? In the acts of defiance of the midwives and on the riverbank, Miriam experienced a God who rises up in outrage against the violence and against the death-worshipping power of the empire. At the seashore, Miriam, in contrast with Moses, proclaimed faith in a God not in need of violence, of horses, of armies and chariots. Now, Miriam is challenging the imperial myth of the redemptive power of violence. She is saying that Moses' God is not the God she remembers from the tradition of the women. The patriarchal God of Moses is a power-hungry, vengeful God, a frightening mirror image of the gods of Egypt who know only domination, submission, punishment, and death. Moses' God has taken on fearsome, terrifying proportions. Self-described atheist Richard Dawkins offers a shocking description of what he calls the God of the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament, Dawkins writes, is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. As far as it goes, Dawkins is not making this up. However, this is not the God of the Old Testament. As we are discovering, the picture is much more complex than Dawkins might be willing to admit. It is, however, despite our feelings of discomfort at this point, a not completely inaccurate description of the God in the narrative, whom Moses claims to be the God who has appointed him and who is now leading Israel's people to the promised land. Moses' personal benefactor and the fierce protector of his rule. This is the God, however, Miriam rejects. She is asking, is the God who speaks only through Moses indeed the God we have come to know? It is emphatically not the God of the birthing stool, the riverbank, or the seashore. And at heart, Miriam's quarrel with Moses has to do with the fundamental question, which God are we talking about and calling upon here? It is the question persistently raised by the women who walk in Miriam's footsteps, determined to keep the prophetic tradition alive. Hannah in her song, Mary in the Magnificat, the Syrophoenician woman in her persistent reminder to Jesus of who he really is, something he seemed to have forgotten at that point. and Martha in her bold confession in John chapter 11. It is the question raised by all people oppressed by empires, invaders, and colonizers everywhere who seek justification for their imperial designs in the scriptures. If one reads the Bible carefully, Naomi Gretz writes, there are enough hints that Moses distancing himself from the people may ultimately have been the cause of his downfall. Despite Gretz's gentle phrasing, Moses distancing himself, it is undeniable that Moses' style of governing was costing him serious support among the people, to the extent that it caused his downfall, as it becomes clear in Numbers chapter 20. Miriam speaking up significantly comes immediately after the incomprehensible punishment Yahweh metes out to those who had the craving for meat and hence complained bitterly to Moses, that is against his leadership, and so the passage lets us understand, in effect, against God. Moses was displeased, says verse 10 of chapter 11, but it was God who became very angry. And the two of them worked in tandem and plotted a plan that has all the hallmarks of a setup. Chapter 11, verse 31 to 35 is almost too painful to read. Simply put, we have arrived at the point where it becomes clear that patriarchal rule, divine and human, is not working. It is not what the people need or deserve. But this is what happens when authoritarian rule, secure in the belief of its manifest destiny, the certitude of its exceptionalism, and the blessing of its God, is challenged. Miriam is therefore much more radical than the men who hid the anxiety about Moses' leadership behind complaints about food and yearnings for Egypt. For her, it is not instant gratification that matters. At stake is the ultimate question. If Moses calls upon God, whose God is that? And which God is that? And if it is our God, what kind of liberation are we speaking of here? Miriam is challenging an idea that has taken hold since the appropriation of the Exodus story after the passage through the Red Sea, and is now solidifying in a stringent, exclusivist religious ideology, namely that Yahweh only mediates, speaks, and guides through men. And it is a concentrated, jealously guarded transferal of power from a male God to the males in Israel, and the guarantee of an exclusive male relationship between Yahweh and the men, in which women have no place, standing, or status, except in the shadow of, in subservience to men. It is a distortion of the God who blessed the midwives when they turned their powerlessness into acts of liberatory courage without the permission or support of the men, and of the God who inspired Miriam to stand her ground on the riverbank and to prophesy at the seashore, showing what it means to be a leader of all the people, not just the men. Now Miriam rises up against this ideology and against this ideologized God. This episode is bracketed by Moses' remarkable rejection of rebuke for the male prophets, and his even more remarkable wish for all the Lord's people to become prophets, and Miriam speaking. Most traditional readings see this as a serious transgression. Gretz says that the rabbis call it arrogance and slander, since she speaks against someone greater than herself. This is Miriam's grave sin, as the rabbis describe it, says Gretz, worse than rape and equal to murder. And indeed, for the patriarchal narrative, these are dangerous, rebellious, and if read within the context of ongoing conflict about leadership, they are subversive words. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? If read within the context of the people's growing dissatisfaction with authoritarian rule and cosmetic reform, and most important of all, if we understand Miriam's question to be a prophetic, political, and theological challenge. Then Miriam's words are not petulant jealousy or slander or arrogance, but prophetic truths spoken to power. Indeed, she has already been called a prophet in Exodus 15. Now she picks up that mantle again. She is reasserting herself in her prophetic calling by inserting herself into the rebellion, but correcting the rebellion from its flawed position of romanticizing Egypt and anger about bodily comforts to fundamental revolutionary transformation of leadership and the theological integrity of the call upon God. But the circumstances have changed. The euphoria of the Exodus, the wonders at the Red Sea, the drowning of the armies of Pharaoh, his horses and his chariots, are now challenged by the hardships of freedom and internal tensions about power. Now it is not Pharaoh's armies the Israelites are seeing dead on the seashore. It is the bodies of their kin, slain by Yahweh in collusion with their leader and left in the graves of craving at Kibroth Hattava. The revolution is eating its own children. That jubilation of freedom at the sea, with Miriam's dancing with the women and the men that could embrace the prophetic leadership of Miriam, has perished in the realpolitik of the wilderness and in the patriarchal longing for total control over the women, the people as a whole, and over the narrative of liberation. And Miriam, the leader not cowed by the men, does not wait. It was while they were still at Hazarut that she actually spoke up. Miriam speaks prophetic truth to power, and it is so serious that not Moses responds to this, but Yahweh intervenes directly in defense of Moses. And this is perhaps the answer to Greg's last question. Did Miriam, and indeed and Aaron, threaten Moses? But for all intents and purposes, Aaron does not really count here. It is Miriam who poses the threat. Miriam speaks and refocuses the rebellion. A rebellion about food is no rebellion, she says. What Israel had longed for was that they, in their desperation, imagined they had in Egypt not just food, but food for nothing, they brag in chapter 11, verse 5. Forgotten are the chains, the crushing humiliations, and the life-threatening hardships. Forgotten also is the truth that they paid for this imagined security with their bodies, their hopes, their dignity, and the dreams and lives of their children. Miriam's intervention not only corrects their priorities, it reshapes their imagination. A revolution is not won by recasting the past into an imagined and false generosity of the oppressor who offers one bread in exchange for submission. A revolution is won by imagining and shaping a different future, by understanding that hardship in the wilderness is hardship on the way to freedom, to that alternative future. It is the difference between the delusionary imagination and what Walter Brueggemann calls the prophetic imagination. This is an imagination, he writes, that embraces the very imagination of God. And that means that it not only knows that things could be different, but that the difference could be enacted. And this is what Miriam's prophetic imagination does. Miriam refocuses the rebellion on the questions of the character of liberation and of the God of liberation, on the quality of leadership, of power and powerlessness, and the difference between power and authority. In becoming more than authoritarian, and more so, holding fiercely onto the power of prophecy for himself alone, more and more intolerant of criticism and correction, Moses, knowing that he has no argument in himself, because Yahweh had indeed not only spoken through Moses, more and more he falls back on his own unique relationship with God, calling upon a despotic higher power who works only in his behalf. Miriam has spoken not just against Moses, but against his claim that his way was God's way. That is not insolently challenging a younger sibling who has risen higher than herself. Rather, it is challenging a religious ideology bent on maintaining a male hierarchy, a revisionist male version of the story of liberation, and a male god on the side of male dominance, and the constant threat of violence hanging over the slightest sign of dissent. What Miriam represents is a yearning on the side of the people for that other history to be reclaimed, that history in which the women, the midwives, her mother, and she herself claimed legitimate and revered space in the story of liberation. What Miriam represents is the longing for the God of liberation who takes the side of the oppressed and the weak, the marginalized and the excluded, the radically inclusive God who gave strength to the women in their defiance of the power of Pharaoh, when there was no male Israelite in sight, not in the birth chamber, not on the riverbank. This is taking the rebellion to a totally different level. It is no wonder the narrator cannot let Moses handle this by himself. So he calls in God. The same God who has just shown fierce partiality for Moses and male leadership in Israel by brutal suppression of a rebellion merely about food. Miriam knew this, and yet, like her foremothers in Egypt, despite the risks, she acts. The ominous words in chapter 12, verse 5, "and the Lord heard," now take shape in the form that appears in the doorway of the tent, summoning Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. The narrator makes sure we understand and see it immediately. In verse 1, in the act of rebellion, Miriam was named first. Now, in the act of retribution, she is already diminished, and she is named last, set lower, and set aside for punishment. Her life has now to be saved by the two males in the story. The proper order of things is restored. Aaron, unpunished and his priesthood left intact, but clearly brought to heel, appeals to Moses, not to God. So great is his awe of Moses' power now. "Oh, my Lord, do not punish us for a sin we have so foolishly committed." Moses, in turn, appeals to God. But of an independent relationship between Yahweh and Miriam that existed at the seashore and on the riverbank, there is now no sign. The spirit that had enveloped her on the riverbank and at the seashore is now crushed by the men and their God. She must either forget it ever happened or accept the lie of the dominant narrative that it never happened. It was all a figment of a petty, jealous female mind, after all. She is put in her place, not by Moses, but by his God. In the two most ominous and revealing sentences of this pericope, God asks Miriam, "Why were you not then afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" We should absorb this. It is not love or faith or trust in Yahweh she needs. It is fear of Moses, of men, in other words, and of male power that pleases this God. But conversely, this fearsome God is also a fearful God who fears Miriam's power, her power to question, to defy, and to claim agency and to resist. And as she is punished, God, still angry, responds to Moses' plea for her healing. If her father had but spit in her face. No longer a prophet or a leader, Miriam is reduced to some father's daughter who could be spat in the face. There are sobering lessons to be learned here. God heals, but only grudgingly. But second, so goes the sanctification of patriarchal violence. Every patriarchal father is justified in his anger at an impudent daughter, and every woman who does not know her place will now know that being spat in the face is actually an act of mercy and generosity. She could be, or she should be, grateful because it could have been so much worse. A man can and is allowed to do so much more. She will have reason to be afraid. This is the spirit, I think, that has breathed his foul breath through our societies and into our churches, the same spirit that breathes through the homophobic and patriarchal Nashville statement of August 30th. But even here, the patriarchal text cannot suppress the truth completely. It is Aaron who begs for mercy for Miriam on her behalf. Miriam herself keeps silent. From her there is no word, no confession, no remorse, no repentance, no call for forgiveness. Not because she is arrogant or that those who accused her of a sin greater than rape are now proven right, but because she knows she has done nothing wrong. She knows she has not sinned against the God of the birthing chamber, the riverbank, and the seashore. She has, in fact, sinned against the patriarchal God of domination, violence, and vengeance. She knows that the God of the Exodus had been captured by the God of conquest. The God that sang and danced with Miriam on the seashore is not the God that stood framed in the doorway of that tent of joyless arrogance and punishment. As Miriam is banished outside the camp until her leprosy is healed, the people refuse to journey on without her. Such was her stature and their trust in her. Tribble captures the situation. She says, those whom she has served do not forsake her in this time of tribulation. They wait. Never do they assail her, as on various occasions they attack Aaron, Moses, and God. And their allegiance survives unto her death. The feminist scholars are right on this point. There is a whole other narrative, a whole other tradition we are not being told here. And black theology has missed it. There are three references in Numbers 20. Verse 1, the people of Israel, the whole community, and the people emphasize their presence when she dies and is buried in Kadesh. The steadfast devotion of the people to Miriam indicates a story different from the regnant one, writes Phyllis Tribble. Miriam's death is mentioned in Numbers 20, verse 1, and in only 7 words. You have to wonder, such a life and only 7 words? It's never explained why. Verse 2 merely reports that there was no water for the congregation as Miriam dies. But are the dried up waters of Meribah, before it became yet another, and for Moses, the final place of contestation, is that a silent cry of inexpressible mourning at the passing of this woman, without whose prophetic leadership the people will now have to face the future and journey on without her? Is it simultaneously a rallying cry for all who embrace the prophetic tradition of Miriam? Miriam dies, and her people feel themselves orphaned. Mother Earth is in mourning and withholds the waters of life. And that withholding triggers the final confrontation with Moses. Numbers 20 also tells us about that rebellion which called forth the sin of Moses. Miriam dies, there is no water, the people rebel, and they ask, why have you brought us up out of Egypt? Berend Marsing's translation I find enlightening. He translates, why did you deceive us with a promise of a land situated on a higher plane? Now Canaan does indeed have a higher elevation, since he speaks of the up from Egypt. But perhaps this is about more than just geography. Can we read in this expectation of a higher plane also the promise of a higher level of leadership than the people had experienced from Pharaoh, his priests, his nobility, and his slave drivers in Egypt? A leadership with more integrity, more decency, more inclusivity, more truthfulness, more compassion, more love, more reflective of the God of the Exodus than Moses' God of the wilderness turned out to be. An elevated leadership of the kind Miriam discerned and called for and actually gave. These insights carry more relevance than we may have been prepared for. In my most recent publication, now I had to do this. And since nobody talks about this new book that's out, I got up at 4 o'clock this morning and thought, how can I slip this in? So, in my most recent publication, entitled Pharaohs on Both Sides of the Blood-Red Waters, I engaged the question of global revolutions for justice and freedom captured by imperial forces from within and by their surrogates from without. In South Africa, we are experiencing on an almost daily basis the consequences of what economist Peter Blanche calls the secret elite conspiracy of 1994 between the wealthy white elite and the black elite within the African National Congress, under the tutelage of the United States and the Bretton Woods institutions. He calls it a fraudulent economic policy that has increased the undeserved wealth of the already white rich, increased the undeserved impoverishment of the already desperately poor black, while creating a small, new, unbelievably rich black aristocracy, making South Africa now one of the most unequal societies on earth. Our negotiators felt themselves obligated not to the interest of our people, but to the secret deals they made with white apartheid South Africa between 1985 and 1994. Because it studiously avoided social justice, restitution, and the redistribution of power, of wealth and social goods, our reconciliation process, in which black South Africans have invested so much, including the social cohesion it was meant to produce and foster, is now under savage strain. In other words, democratic South Africa came into being in disastrous denial of the revolutionary struggles and sacrifices and aspirations and hopes of our people as a triumphant product of imperialism. If black theology had had the insight, the wisdom, and the courage of the Miriamic tradition, rather than our misplaced allegiance to the Mosaic patriarchal tradition, we would have been much more sensitive to the quality of our leadership and much more fiercely protective of the integrity of our liberation. We would have discerned much better the difference between bamboozled by the political expediency of exile politics and being obligated to the sacrifices of our people and the rights of the poor. A Miriamic black theology would have known the difference between being mesmerized by Nelson Mandela and remaining faithful to Jesus of Nazareth. The story here in Numbers 20, somewhat confusing but fascinating throughout, reads as if Moses experienced this as a final straw. He does indeed consult God, and God does indeed respond. But this time, it is a very different response. God responds with genuine concern for the well-being of the people without any accompanying threat of vengefulness because of their complaints, seemingly surprising Moses totally. It equally surprises the reader. Moses shall simply speak to the rock, God says, and water shall flow. Moses, however, is now angry. His disdain shows in the words and in his deeds. Listen, you rebels, he says to the people. Now, they are no longer children whom God must tenderly nurse and nurture, as in Numbers chapter 12. Now there is no distinction between the people on the one hand and the rebel on the other, who instigate them to disobedience. Now they are all rabble. Notably, there is no Miriam anymore to take the lead in the rebellion and to expose the real character of this leadership and the falseness of Moses' claims upon the God of liberation. But Moses is angered, perhaps because even though Miriam is dead and gone, her subversive memory, her challenge to his dictatorship, and her dangerous ideals of prophetic leadership still linger in the minds of the people. So now the narrator allows what up till now we had deemed impossible. Moses sins, he says, and that sin is so great that it turns his God against him. Moses strikes the rock, instead of simply speaking to it as Yahweh had commanded. Scholars are agreed that Numbers 20 verse 2 to 13 indeed tells us about a rebellion in response to which Moses and Aaron, as Marsing puts it, failed to show the people the reflected image of God, which, by the way, is what Miriam had been trying to tell them since Exodus 15. Moses' response, they say, is arrogant, claiming that he and Aaron, not Yahweh, had the power to provide the water. In the end, the author, with supreme irony, accuses Moses of rebellion. Rabbi Pinchas Khan argues for what he calls psychological transference, by which he means that Moses transferred the experience of Rephidim in Exodus 17, where there was a rebellion against Moses, to Meribah, where there was no rebellion. But we can't go into the argument right now. We must raise other questions. Is Moses so wedded to acts of violence to prove and secure his authority? And is Moses so used to the God who strengthens him in his violent expectations that he cannot believe it when he hears God say something else completely? And is at this stage his confidence in himself without the violence so shaky that he willy-nilly clings to what he believes to be the only way that has worked before for him, namely through violence and retribution and revenge? Marsing remarks that the Targum pseudo-Jonathan, quotes, shares the curious information that the first time when Moses struck the rock, drops of blood appears. Perhaps the authors of Targum pseudo-Jonathan, I think, knew better how to metaphorize the hold violence exerts on those who depend on it for strength. Can Moses conceive of leadership without fear, intimidation, and the threat of violent suppression? How else would he now impress the people and reassert his leadership? Deeper, perhaps, can Moses conceive of Yahweh only as vain, violent, and vengeful? Whatever happened here, Moses ignores God's command to let only his words be his power and his authority. Moses' conundrum is the conundrum of every struggle for freedom. A revolution without vengeance, a struggle without the fear-inducing discipline of violence and the promise of retribution. Is that a revolution worthy of the name? If violence is the bedrock of our struggle credentials, how shall we claim victory without it? If liberation is nothing without conquest, the God of the Exodus must give way to the God of conquest. If freedom is unthinkable without conquest and occupation, a compassionate God of love and justice and tenderness is a God too effeminate for the struggle in the wilderness. Moses does not believe that God does not need the violent act in order to be God. But Moses needs a violent God in order to be Moses. Since he cannot speak to the rabble, he will not speak to the rock. And since Yahweh refuses to strike the people, Moses strikes the rock. This is a narrative critical of Moses and of Aaron, says Tribble. It counters the vendetta against her. But it is also a narrative critical of Moses' God. The God of the waters of Meribah is not the same as the God of the fire, the feast of death, and the swallowing of the earth and the plague. Here Moses' God does not come to his aid, not in anger to smite the rebels, not in vengeful defense of Moses and his leadership, and not in tenderness to comfort Moses. The God that Moses had come to count on now forsakes him completely. In the end, the voice of Yahweh is heard, but not in wrath or retribution or the arrogance of violence, but in the creative, life-giving word. It is the God that Miriam worshipped in song and jubilation at the seashore. And as the God of Miriam is recalled, the waters of Meribah become a life-giving source. Tribble speaks of fragments of pro-Miriamic tradition that come to the surface despite the centuries-long efforts to suppress it. She concludes, if Moses be the archetype of the male prophetic tradition, Miriam leads the female. But I have argued here that the prophetic tradition in the Bible is the tradition that begins with the midwives in Exodus 1. Miriam takes it forward. Miriam is not called a prophet because of any prophecies she uttered, of which we find none. She is a prophet because of the tradition she represents and preserves. It is a tradition that calls upon God as the God of the slaves, the one who takes the side of the oppressed in their struggles for freedom and justice against the tyranny of oppressors and the domination of empire. This is a God fundamentally different from and fundamentally in opposition to the gods of empire, who depend on subjugation, the suppression of all dissent, the myths of salvific violence, and the threats of destruction. This God is a God of life-giving hope, whose acts of liberation are acts of radical love, radical inclusivity, radical freedom, and radical resistance. That is not a female prophetic tradition. It is the prophetic tradition of the Bible. The male Moses tradition, as we have seen, is seduced by the needs of patriarchy and the desire to imitate the ways of empire in Israel. It is against that tradition that the Miriamic tradition struggles and survives. And it is this tradition of the birth chamber, the riverbank, the seashore, and the wilderness, not the tradition of the burning bush, the killing fields of Kibrut Hatava, and the conquest of Palestine, that black liberation theology must claim. That is the proper prophetic tradition in which black liberation theology should stand, breathe, and live. And that is the river in our teaching and preaching and living we still need to cross. Thank you so much.
It is our tradition to have questions on the third day of the Beecher lectures, and so we will do that now. We have microphones with people who will come. I would ask you to please identify yourself and to pose your question succinctly, if you would. My way of describing this is please disguise your comments as questions. So if you would do that, the floor is now open to questions. Back here.
Yeah, thank you so much for that inspiring lecture. I'm sorry I missed the other ones. I couldn't attend. But I wondered what...
Kathy, would you identify yourself?
Sorry. Catherine Tanner. I teach theology here at Yale Divinity School. Extremely inspirational lectures. Thanks so much for giving it. And again, I'm sorry I missed the others. But I was wondering, in this inclusive vision, I don't know what you said earlier about the midwives who rescued Moses. Isn't this also an Egyptian tradition? There's an Egyptian view that Moses's God could be associated with, but there's also a tradition against oppression within Egypt that the Israelites are themselves a part of. Would you agree? Or
I am aware that there is such a tradition, or that people claim that there is such a tradition. However, one has to be faithful to the story as it is told in this situation. The Egyptians are the representatives of the Egyptian empire who oppresses and captures and keep as slaves the Israelites. And so whether it is a tradition in Egypt that when a king orders babies to be killed, midwives say no, that may be so. What is important here is that it is not within, let me say, the privileged groups of Egyptian society that this rebellion happens. The midwives stand up as slaves against the empire that has enslaved them. That is the key here. And the next thing that I wanted to be sure that people understood is when this happens, there is not even mention of a male. They are all there on their own. There is not even a God who tells them you got to do this, or who appears in some burning bush to tell them you got to do this. They just know this is the moment. If we don't grab this moment, it's going to be gone for us. So that is for me the wonderful thing here. And it's just like in South Africa, where we now talk about the suffering of black people. One of the first things that some of our white Afrikaner friends, raise is that you got to remember, you may be complaining about what we did to you, but you got to remember what the English did to us in the Boer War in 1899. So I say, so? I mean, must you do us harm, immeasurably so? You've stolen the land in the mean, and that war, by the way, was a war between the British and the English, and it was not even your land. And so for me, I try to resist undermining what happens within the oppressed communities by trying to recall that within the oppressor communities there may be some good traditions. Let them have their good traditions, great. But what happens here, I think, is what is decisive for Israel's history, and in our reading of the Bible, for us as well.
Oh, that was quick. Hi, Angelique Walker-Smith, National Baptist Convention and Bread for the World. So I'm very interested, brilliant, by the way, as usual, brilliant. But I'm interested to know, just sociologically, so Moses was raised as an Egyptian, right? During his years as a child and then to his adulthood. He was a prince, if you will. Miriam was raised in the community of the Israelite people as a daughter of that community. To what extent would you say, or not say, that that had a lot to do with Moses' leadership style, coming out of the context of imperialism as a prince, and Miriam coming out of the Israelite community as a woman, cradled in the rites of passage of women of that time, a sacred tradition, yes, dominated by patriarchy, but still cradled in that tradition of woman in the Israelite community. To what extent would you say that impacted the kind of leadership style that you are making a case for?
Well, if you talk about Miriam, the fact that she was very much aware of that tradition, I gather, I assume that her mother would have sat down with her and explained to her, look, I'm sending you out there to this riverbank where this boy must be hidden, but you got to know, girl, this is what's going to happen. So she was not unaware. We never get to Miriam in this series on the riverbank, but one of the most wonderful things that we have discovered is that when the Bible says that Miriam stood afar off, as the new Revised Translation has it, it is not really that. What it actually says is she stood her ground at a distance. Now, and the distance is not so much the distance between her and Moses, it's the distance that was between Moses and death, which is this much. So that is the distance you should think of, not sort of making paces, 20 paces, 30 paces, 50 paces. But think of Moses, the most vulnerable at that point. So if she understood all of that, I have no doubt that that is the kind of leadership that she saw. in the women that her mother must have told her of. Whether Moses, well, of course Moses grew up, the story says, in the palace. And he may have picked up all those Egyptian mannerisms and ways of thinking and the mindset that is true. But he was not completely unaware, first of all, of the fact that he may have been in Pharaoh's house, but he was never Pharaoh's son. He knew that. He knew, because the Bible also tells us that even while he grew up in the palace, he got angry at the way his people were treated. That's why he acted so impetuously by killing the Egyptian slave master at that point. But the issue of how he responded or not responded, I try to say, those are all side arguments now for me. And I say, the story of Moses is a story that overlays the real story of what happened there. It is a tradition that was built upon what happened with the women out of the need for a male-centered story, a patriarchal deliverer linked to a male patriarchal God. That is what all of this is all about. And that is why Miriam is so prominent in the beginning up until Exodus 15, and then she is drowned almost in that sea with the Egyptians. And it's only by the grace of God that she somehow resurfaces in the book of Numbers. So it's a battle between two traditions. And even though it means for me now that all of those sermons that I preach about Moses will now have to be revisited, to put it mildly, and I have to rethink how one preaches those texts these days. Since I have become convinced that this is the tradition that is being fostered here and nurtured here and birthed here, and that is also the tradition that sustains. So if you take what happens in the birthing chamber, that is the tradition that is picked up right through the Hebrew Bible and into the life of Jesus of Nazareth and even into Paul. And I think that becomes the story. The hard work of conversion from Moses to Miriam is the work that needs to be done now. And I have no doubt it'll be hard work. If I just look at myself, how hard it was for me. And that's the problem with the Bible. The Holy Spirit is sneaky. And what she is. And what she does is, she opens your mind and you think, hey, that's a great idea. And then when you open your eyes, you think, oh my Lord, I'm in trouble here. I never should have embarked on this line of thinking, and that's what she does. And at least that's what's happened to me in the discovery of this thing in preparation for these lectures.
We have 3 questions, so what we're going to do, because of the constraints of time, is let each of you pose your question, and then, Allan, if you'd respond to them, problem. And then we're going to have to call it quits. So, Davida first.
Davida Crabtree. Dr. Boesak, I want to pull us, as your lecture leads us, into the current global situation, into what our own nation here is facing, but what the globe is facing, with the resurgence of patriarchy and nationalism, nativism, you name it, and the question of what is the nature of the leadership that we need to be evidencing in the life of the Christian church today, and what do you think we really need to do about this, not just talk about it? Thank you.
And back over here, and I think there was somebody over here who wanted to ask as well, or maybe in the back. Okay, the 3 of you.
Richard Homer. How do you understand the Passover? Which God was it that sent the angel of death? A very violent act. I've always struggled to make sense of it.
And the last one, right in the very back, if you would.
Mary Beth Adamson from the class of 76. I listen with tears in my eyes and a smile on my face. I work with the gender equality at the United Nations, and I add on to this question about the globe and the lessening voice of women, and especially girls, in a globe that is consistently guarded by palace guards and palace authorities, and not letting those voices really come through. And I seek your thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you for all those questions. Very quickly, Tabitha, I wish that you had been here yesterday and the day before, because I spent considerable time drawing those links, and I hope that it will be possible for her to retrieve this and listen to it, because I make all those links. One of the things of our times, I talk about our world as a world gripped in deadly convulsions, and those convulsions I see the most prominently and clearly in the lives of children and women and LGBTQI people. It is amazing, if one's eyes are open, how one easily sees how these groups are deliberately targeted, and in every way possible. It's always a bit shocking for me what Donald Trump does, and we all sort of watch those big things that he does, and the things that he says out there on the stages, and the threats to the rest of the world. But what I find much, much, much more dangerous is that in the meantime, all these little laws that they change, all these little things that they slip in, and it's all targeting the vulnerable groups, and women and children and gays and prisoners and people of color, and those are not the things Americans are debating, because you are so overwhelmed by all this big stuff. And it's time that the church realizes you got to watch the big evil and not take your eyes off the small evil. And we really have to do that. And the other thing that I see is how women's voices, not just women's rights, all the things that women have gained over years of battle and sacrifice are being rolled back as if it's nothing. I mean, it's so shocking. But not only that, there is an assault upon women that is clearly aimed at making them feel so lost and so insignificant and so helpless. Nothing you can do can stop this. I mean, the way he talks about women is not to brag about himself, is to show women, this is how you are going to be treated from now on. I mean, and I just think there is I always fight against this thought. I say to people, there are no hierarchies of suffering, really. But I sometimes think there are different depths of evil. And that's what we got to watch out for. And what we need is not just women's voices, of course. We need all voices. And men must get up and stand up and say. And not just say, this is what we got to do. The church, I mean, we lost it, right? We dropped the ball in South Africa and here. And we should be on our knees before God, but don't make the prayer too long. Our confession will be most authentic if we confess our loss of prophetic ability, not in the small prayer room or in the Sunday church service, but on the streets. We've got to go out and join those people who are brave enough. That's where we need to be seen. That's where the church in South Africa found God, on the streets, amongst the pain and the blood, and that's where the church here will find God. And that's where God will find out. Because that's where Jesus is. And I always say, if you cannot take your worship of God out of the sanctuary into the streets of protest, I'm not sure what it is that we're trying to do. That whole question, and I don't want it to make it sound very simple, because it isn't very simple. But once you realize that the Exodus story begins with the women and then ends where the woman's participation is silenced, or their voices are taken out and is taken over by the men, then it all makes sense. When Moses at the seashore takes the 2 lines or the 2 verses of Miriam's song that says it all, actually, all the rest from verse 2b onwards, verse 3 especially, where God is now all of a sudden described as a man of war. So now no longer God in God's greatness and mercy and power who is doing all of this. God now needs the warriors of Israel to do what God needs to do. Once that starts and the violence takes over and the masculinity becomes the main thing and the muscularity of the song changes what Miriam had tried to say, then it makes perfect sense to go back and to say this is the only way God could get Israel out of this, through those acts of violence that nobody can explain, but it doesn't matter as long as it shows that God is a man of war. And then you read forward, and that's why in the Song of Moses, he already sings about the conquest of Palestine as a bloody military conquest. And it doesn't matter that the Bible here and there wrestles with that, because it really didn't happen that way. But he also sings of the glories of Jerusalem already. Now, if you go back to 2 Samuel and you see how David conquered Jerusalem, and where he simply said, I don't give a damn whether they are blind or sick or lame or paralyzed, I'll kill them all. That is what we see here. Now, my view is that God is not the God of the burning chamber. It's not the God of the Exodus. There's a difference between the tradition that hails God as the God of the Exodus and the tradition that hails God as the God of the conquest. What the stories have done is they have made the God of the conquest also the God of the Exodus. And I think that's wrong. That the women have pointed us in that direction is one of the greatest services they could have done to us. And I wish that in black theology, at least, we will begin to rethink those issues and talk differently and reflect differently and preach differently and write differently. But I don't know how my colleagues will react when they hear this stuff.